Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me is Tony Roth, Chief Investment Officer at Wilmington Trust, to discuss potential election outcomes and how high net worth clients and advisors should prepare for investment and wealth planning. Tony, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to Trade Talks.
Thanks for having me.
All right, a lot of scenarios we need to work through. What's the likelihood of a Biden victory or a larger blue wave? And how should high net worth individuals adapt to the market impact on Biden's specific policy proposals?
The likelihood of a Biden victory is pretty high at this stage if we trust the polling apparatus, as hopefully improved from 2016. When you look at some of the key states, I would start with Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and New Hampshire. Those states seem to be solidly in Biden's column at this point, outside the range of any kind of normal polling error possibility. So if you give Biden those four states, he only needs one more state, any of North Carolina, Arizona, Georgia, Texas, Florida, or Ohio. That's 6 states. We think he's got a good chance in many of those states. North Carolina, for example, you have a very popular Democratic incumbent governor running. Very unusual for people to split their ticket. He's going to win the Democratic incumbent. That's going to really help Biden in North Carolina. If he wins North Carolina, game over. So not only do we think that there's a good chance of Biden winning, pretty high probability, but we also think that there's a good chance we're going to know on election night. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to have a blue wave. It doesn't mean that the Democrats are going to have a commanding position in the Senate, because you could easily have a Biden outcome and only have the Democrats with 50-51 seats in the Senate, with a number of key moderate Democrats like Joe Manchin, like Hickenlooper in Colorado, that could decide to abandon the Democrats on things like Senate filibuster and otherwise. So Biden outcome, yes. Blue wave, maybe. We really don't know at this point.
So let's talk about some of the impact or some of the risk if a Biden were to win, because of course that's going to be what happens with corporate risk and high net worth individual risk and tax policy and so forth. So I would imagine if you're looking to get gift giving in by the end of the year, that's going to be one of the beneficiaries with the Biden win. Well,
I think that's right. I don't know that. I think of it as a beneficiary, Jill, in the sense that the risk here is that if Biden wins, there may not be the tax changes that we expect, broadly speaking, next year. But the ones that are likely to happen are the ones in the transfer tax, generational tax arena, the ones that really affect the very wealthy. And this is an area where you could see the exemption amounts come down quite significantly. So the beneficiaries are the lawyers here, of course, because we don't know when those laws would take effect. If Biden does win, and we anticipate those laws coming into play next year, they very well could be retroactive to January 1st. So you have a very narrow window to gotta call Saul, which is really call your trust in a state's lawyer as soon as possible. If you wait till after the election, he or she may not be able to take your call, maybe too busy with other clients. It's probably the most significant potential change in the estate tax law in decades, if in fact it happens, with a very narrow window to plan. So it's game on for those lawyers.
So what would happen if it is a Trump victory or somewhat of a contested election, because it's been challenging with Trump to discern what his policy may be? We really didn't get into that much through the debates or
That's right.
We just didn't get into it.
It's, there was a lot of policy talk outside of the context of the debates on the Biden side. Trump has not really been focused on policy so much. So I think that we could assume pretty much a status quo. I think he would try to, on the margin, do things like repeal the payroll tax. But I don't think that we'd see a lot of tax changes, maybe index capital gains, which is probably not even practicable, but that's something that he's talked about for a long time. I think that if Trump were to win, I don't think that there'd be a lot to do from a tax planning standpoint. I also don't think that you'd see necessarily a big reaction in the market. In terms of the market, Jill, what's really critical, there's really 2 things. First is to understand that what matters most right now is fiscal stimulus. We're going over this fiscal cliff. It's been a long time since consumers that are out of work have had that extra, if you will, heroin of expanded unemployment. And it's really important that we get some fiscal stimulus back into the economy. If we have a scenario where we have a contested election, or if Trump were to win and we had an unwillingness on his part or Senate Republicans to just spend anything, I think we'd have a real problem. On the other hand, if Biden wins and you have the Republicans hold on to the Senate, which is really quite unlikely, but it's possible, you'd have the same scenario. The best thing for the market at this stage is probably a Biden win with at least 50 votes in the Senate, so that we have a higher certainty of fiscal stimulus, but not having too many votes in the Senate, because that would actually enable us to have a limitation on the potential for significantly higher taxes. So the sweet spot would be a Biden win and maybe 50 to 52 seats in the Senate for the Democrats, but no more, which would sort of hold the progressives at bay in terms of radically higher taxes.
But see, and that's a good point that you bring up, because clearly we need this stimulus. Forget about the market, right? We know the market's going to react positively to that, but there are millions of American families who probably can't wait the next 2 to 3 months to get these checks to come back in. And that said, I understand it from the human factor, but we have to pay the piper at some point, right? We have to think about how are we going to fund the Social Security Trust, which is expected to run out in 2035 if things remain the same. Like, you know, it's great to have all these things, but you have to pay for them at some point.
Well, I think that there's a likelihood, in terms of the timing, Jill, I think there is a likelihood, regardless of who wins, once we have a victor clear, that you're going to get stimulus this year. It may not be the big package, and it may be a series of small measures, but regardless of who wins, what one has to anticipate is that we're going to have a series of closings across states from a COVID standpoint. Clearly, they're not happening right now because nobody wants to close before the election. It's too political. But once, and we trail Europe throughout the entire pandemic by around 2 to 4 weeks. Mm-hmm. Okay, we know what's happening in Europe right now. They're shutting down. So we're likely to have a significant wave of closures across the country in coming weeks. That, coupled with the, if you will, cessation of the whole political drama of the election, should cause Washington to focus on getting some stimulus out this year. So we think it's likely there will be stimulus this year. We don't think it's going to have to wait until January. We don't think the country can afford to wait. And we don't think that the politicians in Washington will make us wait until January. But the other thing I just wanted to get back to is if Biden does win, the other key factor to keep an eye on that will impact the market is how he's going to form his cabinet, what the composition of that cabinet will be. Because if he picks someone like Senator Warren to be the Treasury Secretary versus like a Laird Brainerd, who's much more moderate, I think that you're going to find a very negative reaction in markets. And so the composition of the cabinet, particularly on that Treasury Secretary role, to a lesser degree, the Department of Labor, those are the two key roles that impact the economy and businesses the most. And depending on how progressive he goes with those roles, assuming he wins, they're going to have a real impact on the market. So we need to think about those as well. The other thing that will probably happen with the Biden win is we're probably going to have a weaker dollar and higher interest rates than we have had with Trump, because a Democratic administration, assuming he gets the Senate, is going to spend more money on top of, you were talking about, we have to pay for it eventually. But certainly there's going to be a lot of debt that's going to need to be issued in order to fund the spending. And that's going to push the dollar down and it's going to push rates up.
All right, Tony, I have one more question for you, because the word drama kind of was a trigger in my head. And I want to get your thoughts around tech regulation, because I'm trying to weigh out, was last week's hearing political theater or something that could structurally change the way these companies operate?
I think that it was a little bit of both last week. So I definitely think that the big tech companies are in the crosshairs, and I think deservedly so. They command a tremendous portion of the economic activity across the economy, and there are respects in which they are monopolistic. Having said that, I think that some of the activity that we've seen so far does have a bit of a tone of being a little bit political, coming so close to the election, and to some degree focusing on some of the social media companies that have rightly or wrongly clamped down on some of the tweeting that we've seen. So there has been a bit of a political tone to it lately, but I do think that the antitrust activity is well placed and it will continue. And after we get through this political cycle, we'll get a better sense of whether or not it's going to be directed at one type of company or another type of company. Is it going to be directed at the social media type of companies, or might it be directed at more search and software and cloud monopoly across the industry? And so I think that'll be very important. But however, Jill, we still think that even with that, these companies are going to be the leaders in the economy. So the growth tech-oriented stocks, even with some headwinds from antitrust, are going to continue to lead over the long term. There could be a value or cyclical rotation again, but we still think that an overweight in those kinds of stocks are where portfolios need to be, and clients need to be fully invested going into this election, or very, very close to being fully invested. Because once the markets take off, and they will, because we will get a vaccine, we will get out of this, you don't want to be underinvested. The hardest thing to do in investing is to get back in once you've gotten out.
All right, Tony, great to catch up with you. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks.
Thanks for having me.
You got it. And thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.